Let me welcome everybody who decided to attend this workshop on the economics of cybersecurity. My name is Claudio Biancotti. I'm from the International Relations Department of the Bank of Italy. I'm going to be extremely brief, and then I'll just give the floor to the speakers. The reason why we organized this workshop is there is a growing literature on the connections between cybersecurity and the economy, and this literature encompasses a number of very diverse fields, starting from more methodological ones like assessing the cost of cyber incidents, predicting the frequency of cyber incidents, to research questions that are a bit more specific to economics, such as what's the impact of a cyber attack on a perspective, how do we minimize it, which corporate strategies are best to risk, etc. So I think in this conference, starting from the first edition, there always were a few papers on the economic aspect of cybersecurity, except for I think last year, because at the onset of the pandemic, it was to organize around this. So let me just introduce the first speaker, and so I think Gabriele has already been marked the center. Just let me check that everything is working, and I will leave it.
Okay.
So this first session in the workshop on the economics of cybersecurity is going to be about corporates, and in particular, we're going to look at the drivers of corporate investment in cybersecurity. So please, Gabriele, you can get started with the first page. We're going to have a 15-minute presentation, a very short discussion, and then 10 minutes for a Q&A for every paper. So please write your questions in the chat if you have any during the presentation, and make sure that you present them after the end of the presentation. So thank you. I shut up now. Gabriele,
fantastic. Thank you very much, Claudia, for introducing me and for this amazing opportunity. I'm super happy to see so many people attending these sessions, and I'm looking forward to interact with you all and to answer your eventual questions. First of all, can you see my slides? Is everything working fine? Claudia, can you just confirm that I'm sharing the right screen?
Yeah, it's good. It's good. The only problem I see here is that your slides are quite small. You're in preview mode, so you might want to go full screen.
Because then let me just fix it right away.
Okay. Okay. So just go full screen in the PPT.
Share my screen.
You're still in preview mode.
Screen number 2. And now you should see it right.
Yes, right.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much. Right, so first of all, again, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Gabriele Lattanzio. I'm an assistant professor of finance at the Nazarbayev University. It's a university located in Kazakhstan. I just moved there literally a few days ago. I used to be at Monash University before in Australia, in Melbourne. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about the drivers of cybersecurity awareness, and in particular, I'm going to discuss this paper co-authored with Jérôme Tellard. Jérôme is a very good friend of mine. He's an associate professor in finance at Babson College in Boston. And I think this is a question that, this is a paper that fits very well these sessions, and that it's a great introduction to this very interesting workshop. Because what we're going to do here, what I'm going to discuss with you today is what I believe to be the seminal question, the first question that as academic, as market practitioner, we need to answer to fully understand what's going on in the cybersecurity space, especially with respect to the corporate world. And this is the question about what are the drivers of corporate engagement in cybersecurity, of the building process of a positive cybersecurity culture at the corporate level? This sounds like a naive question. It's actually not. How do we push firms towards building a positive attitude towards managing in a proactive way the emerging source of risk? Should we be working at the board of director level? Should we be working at the CEO level? Should we be training the middle management? Is it a mixture of all of this? All these questions today are still unanswered. The value implication of having a director who is actually committed and that has an understanding of how to deal with this specific source of risk are still not clear, and this is exactly what we're gonna try to answer with this specific study. And what we did, since empirical studies are not there, is to start by looking at history. And if we look at the worst data breaches that have taken place, especially in the United States over the last 10 years, you can immediately spot a trend. There's a common denominator that characterizes them all. Every time something really bad happened, what we observe, the feature characterizing those companies is lack of leadership, lack of a governance structure, lack of CEO commitment towards cybersecurity risk and understanding of cybersecurity threats. And in this case, the textbook case is the Yahoo data breach that occurred in 2013, 2014. For those of you that are not familiar with the case, what happened is that Yahoo suffered a series of data breaches that exposed personal information for about 3 billion users, more or less. So it was a huge scandal. And the interesting thing of this case is that here we have in which the CEO had absolutely no commitment towards establishing a cybersecurity culture within the firm. The CEO actually, Dr. Mayers, withheld information from the board of directors, didn't disclose information to its chief information security officer, and at the board level, no independent director nor the insider director actually engaged with asking questions about the cybersecurity profile of the firm. So there was a completely lack of governance of this matter, which resulted in a disaster, which ultimately resulted in 2019 in derivative shareholder lawsuits being settled for $170 million. Now, the settlement for a multi-billion-dollar company is not that large, it's not little, but this established a very important precedent in this specific area, because what it ultimately established was the liability of the member of the board of directors with respect to cybersecurity issue. The lack of oversight from a director perspective of this specific source of risk can now result in a breach of the director's fiduciary duty, which is extremely important because formally, not only economically, but formally put at the center of the scene the board of directors. Yet, despite we have all this shock, despite this textbook case that has evolved over the last 7 years, if we look at what's happening in corporate America, and if we look, sorry, my PowerPoint collapsed for some reason. Let me reopen the file. Rapidly. Here we are. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, it's good. It's good. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. If we look at what's happening in corporate America now, it's scary because a recent survey conducted by the NASDAQ highlighted the fact that virtually all board members of publicly traded US corporations are absolutely not engaged with the management or have absolutely no skills, technical skills to actually understand the cybersecurity profile of the corporation. 98% of the non-executives, the independent directors sitting on the board, actually stated that they do believe, they have this belief that their corporation is actually not organized to monitor all their devices and that there's no strategic response plan in place to block in a timely manner an eventual cyber attack. On top of that, 90% of all directors admitted to be unable to interpret the cybersecurity report. So they are just unable to take informed action or reaction to deal with this emerging source of risk. And actually 40% of the board members admitted or stated that they do not feel responsible at all, nor economically, nor legally, for the eventual repercussion of a cyber attack. These statistics are scary because they highlight the fact that there's a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding at the boardroom level that we need to tackle. But before to push through shareholder engagement rather than a regulatory action, to try to push firms to bring in the boardroom people with this kind of human capital, with this kind of skills, we need first to assess whether increasing directors' awareness of cybersecurity threats, of cybersecurity risk, actually result in better outcome. And this is what we try to do in this paper. Obviously, this is a very complicated question from an economic and econometric perspective. Because ultimately, there's nothing more endogenous than a board of directors, than firm's corporate governance structure. So what we do is to exploit a setting similar to the one used by INEA and Roth in their 2020 working paper on environmental regulation. And we try to bring in exogenous variation in directors' cybersecurity awareness by looking at exogenous variation in the exposure of US firms director to the staggering introduction of cybersecurity reforms abroad. Sounds complicated, it's not. What we are doing in plain English is to take a corporation incorporated in the United States and we look at the board of directors. Let's assume that this firm Alpha, as a director, is also sitting on the board of a French firm. What we do is to look whether the passage of a cybersecurity reform in France has material and immediate implication on the cybersecurity profile of the US corporation. Now, importantly, nothing is happening to the US firm. So if anything changes in the cybersecurity profile of the American firm, it must be happening through the increased awareness, cybersecurity awareness of the interlocked directors, so that we can provide eventual causal estimates here of the eventual importance of board members in defining a firm's corporate cybersecurity profile. So obviously, to engage in this kind of experiment, what we need to do is to create ex novo a very, very important data set, gathering information on all cybersecurity reforms that have taken place across countries. And we do that by collecting data from different sources on 6 different types of cybersecurity related reforms. They can be related to national security, military, critical infrastructure, and so on. And we build this data set into covering 187 countries for the period 1990 to 2020. And this data set incorporates about 530 cybersecurity reforms that occur over the studied period. Now, since this is a new data set, it makes sense to just spend 30 seconds on looking at this data that open up a lot of interesting avenues for future research. Just looking at the time series, it's already extremely interesting, because what you can see is that the government engagement in cybersecurity reform spiked at the beginning of the last decade in 2010 to 2013, that's been declining ever since. Now, the early adopter were Western countries, mostly, with European and countries in the United States adopting some sort of cybersecurity reform earlier on. And if we keep looking at this time series, what we will be observing now in 2019, 2020, 2021 is a new wave of cybersecurity reforms occurring mostly in this Western country, which already is interesting, because what it's saying is that the life cycle of this cybersecurity reform is very limited, is about 1 decade, and this reform become obsolete very, very fast. Over the next few years, with the increasing pace of technological innovation, one of the major tasks of governments will be to keep up to date these laws, because the scenario, the landscape, the competitive landscape is changing at such a rate that will require a lot of revision of these laws over time. But from an empirical perspective, now we have exactly what we want. We have this interlocked directorship, and what we're going to do is to study the cybersecurity profile of firm I, we're talking about American corporation, And we're going to look at how it changed following a reform that occurred in a country, in an interlocked country, after controlling for a wide array of variables and very high dimension of fixed effect, including firm level, industry year level, and state of incorporation year level fixed effect. So it's a very conservative specification. And what we identify, as you can see here from table 1, is that as board members, as director cybersecurity awareness increase, what we observe is that the quantity of cybersecurity related disclosure, how much a firm disclose related to its cybersecurity profile, immediately increase. Its cybersecurity risk measure, as in Michaeli et al. 2020, dropped significantly, I think about 5 to 7%. And also, very interestingly, the likelihood of the firm shocked through this treatment of having a cybersecurity insurance in place increased by about 7 to 10%. So what these results are telling us is that the board of directors is crucial to establish, to build up a positive attitude towards cybersecurity risk. Indeed, what we're observing right now in the United States is a trend, the emergence of a new committee that is generally called the Security Committee, in which indeed the board of directors delegates to some of its members the role of oversight in cybersecurity and physical security risk. However, these committees are still very rare and their effectiveness is still to be studied, but what our results truly emphasize here is the possibility of increasing, of improving a corporate cybersecurity performance by working at the brain level, at the boardroom level. Also, there's the byproduct of these results, which is extremely interesting. What we're showing here is that regulations adopted abroad spill over across country through a networking channel. So the takeaway from this byproduct, from this very interesting result, is that commitment towards attempts to reform a cybersecurity institutional framework, regulatory framework, in isolation, ignoring what's going on everywhere else in the world, will likely result in a set of unintended consequences, will be at the very least very much myopic. Now, ultimately, though, what we really want to assess is whether the increased transparency, the increased disclosure result in positive effect, at least for shareholders. I don't want to make big claim about social welfare, but let's look at least at the firm value. And what we observe, consistent with results in Lattanzio and Ma 2020, Ronnie Michaelis et al. 2020, as cybersecurity disclosure increase, as the way corporations manage cybersecurity risk improve, risk-adjusted returns improve. There's a premium in the market for being a cybersecurity leader. Tail risk, crash risk decline, and also very interestingly, market beta decline, which for the finance people in the room, this is a very interesting result because it emphasizes how cybersecurity risk is at least partially a systemic component or priced as a systemic risk in the market. So overall, and then I'm happy to take questions and to open up the floor for discussion. What we're showing here is that the board of directors matters a lot at building cybersecurity awareness, at building a positive attitude towards dealing with this emerging source of risk. Increasing directors' skills, human capital in this specific area, bringing in people with this specific set of skills or exposure to cybersecurity threats results in improvement in transparency, disclosure quality, which ultimately results in higher shareholder value, which is exactly what we're all after. So working at the board level, creating a demand for director with expertise in this area is something that shareholders of publicly traded corporations at the very least should value and should consider to engage in over the next few years, because the benefits by far outweigh the cost. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Claudia, for the time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and eventual questions.
Thank you, Gabriele, for this extremely interesting paper. I will remind everybody that the chat is open for your questions. So if you have anything to ask, please write a message. And I'll start with a couple of observations. Can you please go back to the slide where you were showing the first regression results?
Absolutely. Let me.
Thank you. Just the first one.
Here we are. No, sorry.
No, okay, this one. So I'm very interested here in understanding a little bit more about your results and especially about what you said on international spillovers. This is, I think, a super important theme. And we have seen that sometimes even the CEOs of large corporations, and I'm thinking of Google, Facebook, and other digital platforms that operate in different countries, they say they have a cost from regulatory fragmentation. And of course, this might be something they are not saying in good faith because there is a conflict of interest. So I'm trying to figure out have you tested in any way for the fact that a given company also has a business presence in the country where cybersecurity regulation changed? I mean, does this happen? The real question I'm trying to ask is, you're saying there's international spillovers in awareness. So if a director sits on a board in France and there is a new law in France, they're going to understand the problem and they are going to bring their knowledge back to the US. But I'm wondering, is this changing depending on whether they're also the companies, the US company is also doing business in France or not?
So this is a great question. So the short answer is this is exactly what we're trying to do now. We have the segment data from CompuStat. So we are matching firms based on their reliance on the treated country. So we're basically matching our revenues from, example given, the French market. These results that you see, they're not matched on exposure to this country. Preliminary results, though, show that the effect is mitigated once we, or shrinks a little bit in economic terms once we match on revenues in that country, but it doesn't disappear. So there is a learning effect, and it seems to be pretty robust. Now, there is also a direct effect on the corporation, and this is exactly what I'm going to discuss later on in my second paper that I'm going to present at 11, especially with respect to certain cybersecurity reforms that have occurred, especially in developing countries. So I do believe that both forces here exist and that both forces have material implication. Obviously, when you see CEOs complaining about fragmentation, there are two issues going on. The first one is a strategic game in which they try to get the most out of a bargaining process. The second one, this is a real issue that in multinational corporations are facing. The current cybersecurity regulatory environment is extremely fragmented. Cybersecurity reforms in different countries, they differ materially, imposing huge compliance costs to firms. This is a fact. And dealing with this cost going forward is going to be a major task for governments all over the world. And I do believe that international organizations should be brought in, the WTO or other organizations, to try to standardize, at the very least, issues concerning to privacy, data ownership, and data sovereignty, because those are major issues that are imposing material economic costs on multinational corporations. Briefly, with respect to your question, the effect cannot be fully explained by a direct implication of the reform on the treated firms.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's terrific, because it goes to show that there's different channels at work here. And just a follow-up question. I would like to know if perhaps you could expand a bit more on your definition of cybersecurity risk, the way you measure this variable in your regression table.
Yeah, I flew through it. I'm sorry. So cybersecurity risk is measured here in two ways. The results that you see here are based on the cybersecurity risk measure developed in Michaeli et al. 2020. What they do basically is to look at firms' 10Ks, so firm public disclosure, and what they do is to look at how similar a firm's disclosure is to a firm that suffered from a data breach in T-1. So in plain English, what they do, they take all firms that suffer from a data breach in T+1, they look at the way they talk about cybersecurity risk, and they look for similarities after adjusting, obviously, for industry effects between the firms that suffer from such an event and all the other firms in the economy. The idea is that the closer you are in terms of the way you talk about this risk in your 10K, the riskier you are. And this seems to have some internal validity at the very least for this measure. The second way I did measure for cybersecurity risk is using a measure that is much simpler, and I developed in my paper with Martma. And that's a measure that is, again, based on public disclosure. So we read the 10Ks, but rather than comparing to some firms that was selected as a target and successfully suffer from a successful cyber attack, what we do is basically to rank firms within an industry year and see, after adjusting for several components, which one seems to be the most worried about possible data breaches in T+1. Both measures are successful, or at least are associated with the future occurrence of a data breach. And that's how generally these measures are validated. Are they perfect? Probably not. There are some issues that the literature is still trying to solve, but those are going to have a large sample. Unfortunately, micro-level data are extremely limited, and we will not be able to make large sample inferences only based on those.
Okay, thank you so much, Gabriele. And I would have a couple of more observations on this very interesting paper, but I will have to make them bilaterally because we're running out of time for this paper.
Sure.
And so I think that right now it's Christian's turn with a paper on reputational risk, cyber insurance, and the market value of breached firms. So please, Christian, can go ahead with your paper. Thank you, Gabriele. Thank you again.
Thank you, Javier.
Let me try to share. Can you see? Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, good morning, everyone. First of all, I join Gabriele in thanking you, Claudia, for taking the time to organize the workshop and for giving us the chance to present our paper. The paper I'm going to present is a joint work with Gabriele Lattanzio, and it studies the relation between cyber insurance and reputational costs as measured by stock market prices variation. As we know, cyber breaches cause direct costs and indirect costs. This last category of cost includes elements that are not directly observable as per definition, but that might be even larger than the direct cost. The interesting thing is that in the case of a listed firm, the variation of stock market value is generally adopted as a good proxy for the cost caused by a cyber breach. And such measure is based on the efficient market hypothesis, firstly formulated by Fama in 1969. To provide some context, I cite here two examples, famous examples of stock market reaction to cyber breaches. The first one involves Capital One Bank, which is one of the largest banks in the US. The company lost nearly 6% of its value immediately after the announcement of a cyber breach, and almost 14% of its value over the following 2 weeks. So we are talking about relevant values. Even more relevant is the case of Equifax, which is a consumer credit reporting agency in the US always, that lost almost 54% of its value in just 1 week after the breach announcement. So to study reputation and cyber insurance, first we need a definition of reputation and reputational risk. In our context, the definition given by the Basel Committee in 2009 seems to be the more fitting. That is, reputational risk is seen as the risk arising from the negative perception on the part of the investors, indeed on the part of many other stakeholders, but we focus on the investor here, that can adversely affect the firm's ability to maintain an access to the source of funding. And in our context, we are talking about equity funding. The other element is cybersecurity, cyber insurance. Cyber insurance, as they are nowadays, do not cover this kind of risk, this reputational risk. Moreover, cyber insurance market is immature in the sense that the number and the variety of the policy supplied is limited. It is often a non-competitive market. We have a few big players in the market, and as any other insurance market is affected by information asymmetry. So when we look at the literature, we see that the prevailing consensus is that cybersecurity breaches have a negative impact on the market value of a breached firms. So when there is a breach, we usually see a plunge in the market value of the affected firms. The interesting point is that no analysis so far consider the role of cyber insurance in this mechanism. Most part of the studies adopt as a statistical technique the event study to estimate the variation of the price, the equity price after the breach. We adopt the same statistical technique, but with a novel focus on cyber insurance. Moreover, we provide a theoretical model to microfound what we find in the data. The interesting point is that very few contributions so far tackle the problem of stock market reaction from a theoretical point of view. The only exception we are aware of is CAMIA 2020. We are still working on the theoretical model, so here I sketch just the main element of the model. In our paper, we set up a game theoretical model, a sequential model that focuses both on what happens on the insurance market and on the equity market. On the insurance market, we have one risk-neutral insurers offering policies. We have information asymmetry because insurers cannot observe directly the firm's risk type. And as Stiglitz in 1977 already proved, in this framework, the only stable separating equilibrium is when high-risk firms buy full coverage, while low-risk firms prefer partial coverage or no coverage at all. Then we focus on the equity market. Here we have as well information asymmetry because investors cannot see the risk type of the firm, but they can only observe whether the firm is insured or not. And then on this basis, they are offering a financing contract. So they consider the insurance as a signal of the risk of the firm. The interesting element is that investors seem to appreciate the firms that are cyber insured because these firms seem to enjoy lower equity cost. Then in the final stage, we model the breach and see how this impact on the stock market equity valuation. So on this basis, we formulate our three hypotheses. The first one is in line with the literature. In fact, we hypothesize that the disclosure of a cyber breach has a negative impact. In other terms, that the reputational costs are positive. The other two hypotheses are new. We hypothesize that the reputational costs are different when we distinguish cyber-insured from non-cyber-insured firms. And finally, we hypothesize that reputational costs are lower for cyber-insured firms. To carry out our empirical part, we need two measures. One is the measure of cyber risk. The other is an insurance indicator. Gabriele already mentioned the first one, a cyber risk. Both are based on the content analysis of Form 10K declaration that each firm in the US is obliged to submit to the Security and Exchange Commission. And the assumption is that the quantity of cyber-related disclosure is positively correlated to the extent to which a firm is exposed to these threats. In other terms, the more a firm writes about cyber security issues, the likelier it is that it is exposed to these same threats. The same for cyber insurance. The quantity of cyber insurance information disclosed in these 10K forms is positively correlated to the status of being insured. The more the firm is writing about cyber insurance, the likelier it is that the firm is insured. We focus on the US stock exchange market. We have 183 data points, and we can distinguish on the basis of the insurance indicator cyber-insured from non-cyber-insured firms. But first of all, we look at what happens on the cyber insurance market. Here you see a linear probability model in which the dependent variable is our cybersecurity indicator, insurance indicator, and it is regressed on a set of independent variables. One of these is our cybersecurity risk measure. The others are control variables that are correlated with cyber breaches. So we see that the higher the risk, the higher is the probability of a firm to be insured. And this seems to be a very robust, very significant result. In other terms, we have adverse selection on the insurance market. We also have a significant and positive effect of firm size. The bigger the firm, the likelier it is that the firm is insured against cyber risk. Here we have the results of the event study. First, we conduct the event studies on the full sample, considering different time windows. We see that we have an effect for the first time window, so 1 day after the breach. It is a negative variation in line with what we would expect and in line with the literature. But when we extend the time window, this effect disappears. It is no more significant. When we split the sample between insured and uninsured firm, we see that for uninsured firm, we cannot detect any effect whatsoever. The percentage are negative in the first 2 time windows, but not significant. On the contrary, for the insured firm, we detect a significant negative effect, reaction, which is also persistent because we can enlarge the time window and see still the effect up to 5 days after the breach. So to conclude, our first hypothesis, so there is a negative reaction overall, is supported, but the effect is very short-lived. When we extend the time window, the effect disappears. we see a significant difference in reputational costs between insured and non-insured firms. So indeed, cyber insurance seems to play a huge, a relevant role in the stock market reaction. However, our last hypothesis that the cost is lower for insured firm is not supported, because if you go back, you see that the variation is still over 1%. So it seems that the costs are higher for the insured firm, which is interesting and counterintuitive result. So we are working on this hypothesis to explain actually the mechanism underpinning this mechanism. And we also try to complement the novel results about adverse selection to see whether there is adverse selection not only on the coverage level, but also on the price and the premium level. We try to see whether the insurers already price in adverse selection in their premium. So that's it. I thank you for your attention, and any feedback, any comment is more than welcome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Christian, for presenting this very interesting paper. Working on cyber insurance is a challenge. It's super difficult because, as you said, we don't have that many data. The insurers themselves don't have data, so starting to work on these subjects is absolutely paramount. So there's a couple of points I wanted to make on this work. Can you please? Yeah, that's exactly the table I wanted to see. Except, can you make it a little bigger, because it came out in the small version for some reason. Right. So can you go back for a minute to table 1? Okay, perfect. Then we'll go to table 3. So one of the core ideas that you're discussing here is the possibility of adverse selection. And you just said that this is the part that you want to focus on in the future. So from what I remember, from what I understood from my own research on cyber insurance and the frequency and cost of cyber breaches, one very important driver of cyber risk for firms is the sector where they operate. So high technology firms that handle more data and have more sensitive processes online are more exposed compared to a brick and mortar, store where you sell clothing or textiles or any other good or service that's not high tech. So I'm sure there must be a part of this story that is reflected in insurance behavior. And when we collected super preliminary data on cyber insurance at the Bank of Italy, that's what we saw. That if you divided firms according to their tech intensity, and it was measured using standard European indicators, you had a much higher take-up of insurance on the part of high-tech companies compared to low-tech companies. And at the same time, you had higher risk in these sectors compared to other sectors. But I'm not sure that you can call it adverse selection. I think that you should find a way here to take out the sector-specific effects in a credible way, because otherwise you're saying all of this phenomenon is adverse selection. All of this phenomenon is exploiting asymmetric information. And I don't think it's the case. I think part of this correlation that you see between risk and the probability of being insured comes straight from a sectoral driver, from a tech driver. And also there is a correlation between the technology intensity of a company and the company's ability to understand the cyber risk and decide that they want insurance. So I think this needs to be fleshed out, and that's observation number 1. And observation number 2, and can you please mute your mics because there is a lot of background noise. So, okay, thank you. The other point I wanted to make is speak to a question I have. I mean, I don't have the answer. It's a genuine question. Is there a non-linear effect depending on size in certain specific high technology sectors? What I'm thinking here is, again, the big platforms. The big platforms, they all had data breaches of some sort. Perhaps, you know, excluding Apple. But while it's true that you had, I think, 22% negative stock market returns for Facebook in the right after Cambridge Analytica, at the end of the day, these companies are still adding users, and in the long run, their prices only go up. So I'm wondering whether, if a company passes a certain threshold and it becomes something that's perceived as necessary by its users, then users don't care about the breach so much, and it means that they keep on being on the platform, and this means, of course, they see ads and the revenue goes up, and so investors are going to be confident. What I'm trying to say is that we had horrible security and privacy practices in the major players in the platform space, but this didn't kill them on the market. Whereas it dealt a huge blow to Equifax, which is not even a digital platform. But in that case, of course, I mean, if you're a credit scoring agency, you have customer trust at your core because you're handling confidential data, and people understand that. And that might be the same case for, you know, social media, but people don't understand that. So I wanted to know whether there was some non-linearity that you could catch in this, because it's, I mean, it's a bit mind-boggling that these companies keep on getting attacked and they never died. And they never die. So I think I'm done with this first round of observations. So if you want to answer, please.
So first of all, thank you. It's very on the point observation. For the second observation you have, I absolutely agree. We are taking account of the firm size, but they might be non-linear effects. And we should also take this into account. I don't know how technically, to be honest. Maybe Gabriele has some ideas more on that, but definitely yes. And definitely yes, also on your first observation, sectors. We are taking care of the sectors and other fixed effect variables. So we are not completely ignoring this effect, but yes, I think that for at least for the technical, the technological industry and information and communication technology industry, maybe we could use some other techniques to flesh out this effect, because, as you said, this sector in particular might be an outlier. So, yes, I completely agree.
Maybe can I jump?
Yeah.
Just a few points. So with respect to the first question, Christian answered very well. That's exactly why we're using the linear probability model, so that we can use at least this high-dimensional fixed effect to tease out some of these effects. The use of firm fixed effect in combination with industrial fixed effect, defined as in Oberg and Phillips, help at the margin, at the very least. But since we have time varying industry definition, we can try to come up with some high-tech dummy variable to capture eventual variation that we were not capturing at the current stage. With respect to the size effect, I'm not sure. I don't think it's per se a size effect. Because we have cases of necessary firms very well established that were hit hard and took a lot of time and a lot of effort to recover. Example given Equifax in the United States. It bounced back. It took time, and it was difficult to recover from that reputational punch. What I think that it's driving the resilience of this firm, though, more than size is the lack of product market competition. All these firms that we're seeing, they are operating in product markets that are virtually, I don't want to call them natural oligopoly, but we're pretty close to that. The lack of competition makes this firm much more resilient because where do you go? You want to run away from Facebook? That's still the social square, the place that everyone wants to go to. And the barrier to entry in that industry are so high that it will take time, build a lot of $1 billion to substitute such a firm. So product market competition, I think it's the main driver here of such a resilience. But I agree that this is something very interesting that we need to better understand. Also, beside the reputational cost, the direct costs are generally relatively small for these firms of a few hundreds $1 million. It's nothing in the big scheme of things. And the reputational cost seems to vanish out in the long term. So these kind of events don't leave a durable scar on Facebook face for some reason. But this is something that we need to keep studying because it's crucial to understand how to address this kind of issue and create the right incentives in the marketplace.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just, I mean, your answers were extremely clear. Let me just follow up with a couple of points that might be useful. When it comes to the sector effect, my experience is that sectors can be kind of heterogeneous internally in terms of tech intensity. So what you really want to look at is a measure of tech intensity. And for example, the European Union has a definition of sectors based on the tech intensity, a classification, sorry, not a definition. And I think you might want to try. I mean, I saw it worked. And also in the case of the second variable we were addressing, competition in product markets, I think you can just, try to place it in the regression in terms of market shares or number of users, whatever. It might be super interesting. But I see that we have a question from Alessandro Federe in the chat. So Christian, can you see the chat, or do you want me to read the question out to you? You're muted. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I cannot see the chat actually.
Okay, so can you please go back to the assumptions slide?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is
the assumption.
The slide.
Hypothesis.
Okay, yeah. Exactly. There you go. So, so the question is, why do you posit assumption H1B if this is not supported by the empirical result? Do you aim to highlight the counterintuition?
That's really the point, because thank you for the question, Alessandro, first of all. The point is that what we would expect as a priori is that cyber insured firms should pay a lower cost in terms of market value variation after a breach, just because they are insured. Because we already seen that on the equity market, if you are an insured firms, you tend to pay a lower equity cost. So on this basis, we can expect that when the breach is announced, you suffer less. But this is not what we see in the data. And this is the counterintuitive point we are trying to explain also with the help of the theoretical model. So that's precisely the point. I wanted to highlight this fact because it is counterintuitive and because it is one of the interesting points of this paper.
Okay, don't see any other questions in the chat, so I'll ask one final question. So Alessandro said thank you in the chat, and Christian, you can't see it, so
thank you.
When it comes to differentiating between insured and uninsured firms, do you have any additional information on the extent of insurance coverage or the type of coverage? Because as far as I remember, cyber insurance policies are very different, and it's so I was wondering whether you could give some indicator of insurance intensity. No, okay, no data, right?
No, no data. We are trying to collect data about premia, insurance premia. We are in the process of actually, but we do not have any other data. Gabriele, you can confirm, but
yeah, unfortunately for the US, this kind of information or are voluntarily disclosed or are very difficult to be gathered. And as of today, the only thing we can have is an indicator of how likely it is that you have an insurance contract in place. But we don't know the coverage ratio, we don't know the premium you pay. So we are unfortunately limited by data availability. And that's the extent to which we can go to date. But hopefully, and this is also a call and a cry for data collection. If anybody has any source of data with respect to this economic dimension, please let me know in the chat or send me an email, because that's exactly where we're trying to get. The whole point of the paper is we can't understand the financial, economic, and social implication of cybersecurity risk without understanding how the insurance market is evolving. And we're trying to shed light on the current dynamics.
Yeah, no, I totally understand the issue with this kind of data. I've run into it before. And when it comes to the data gaps issues, we're going to go back to it later in the workshop, because I don't know how many people who are attending the workshop are familiar with the economic literature on cyber. Maybe some of you are just curious about what is it, and you have other backgrounds. And I will take the opportunity to say that the most significant problem in this field is that for one reason or the other, there is no data, or the data are bad. So it's very difficult to find data set that's good enough to carry out a study. But I see that a lot of interesting efforts are being made, starting from your papers. So I think we have 30 seconds left. So I will just stop here. We break for 50 minutes. We reconvene at 11:15 sharp to start again with the second session of the workshop. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating, and see you in 15 minutes.
thank you.
Thank you, Christian. So welcome back, everybody. We're ready to start the second session of the workshop. And the second session is about measuring the frequency and cost of cyber incidents. And as we were saying before, the very limited availability of data makes this one of the most important challenges in the economics of cybersecurity. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the headlines. $300 billion per year are lost because of cyber incidents or other extremely high figures that appear in reports of cybersecurity companies. But of course, these companies have an incentive to inflate the figures. And the number of independent data sets that exist on this matter, I think, is 2 or 3 in the world. And it's not only lack of data, there's also a problem of methodology. This is a phenomenon with long tails. You have maybe a lot of very small incidents, and then you have a huge breach that is more expensive compared to all the small incidents put together. And modeling rare events, long tail distributions is notoriously hard, especially because we don't really have numbers for these mega incidents, etc. So I will leave the floor again to Christian for the first paper of this session. So Christian, please, whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Let me share the screen as usual. Okay, I hope you can see it. Okay, this paper, which I co-author with Claudia Di Caterina and Davide Ferrari, focuses on another important aspect of cybersecurity, namely the relation between cost of breaches and investments in countermeasures. So the digital transformation exposes users to a growing number of cyber threats. Also, for this reason, cybersecurity has become a top priority in the European Union digitalization agenda. Firms, in particular, are the target of a growing wave of cyber crimes. However, there are still many obstacles to the management of cyber risk within a company. One of these obstacles is the lack of evidence on the effectiveness of cybersecurity countermeasures. In fact, often chief information officers rely on fear, uncertainty, and doubt to promote cybersecurity investment and cybersecurity policies to the upper management. Our paper is a statistical methodology contribution that studies the relation between cost of cyber breaches and investment in countermeasures, providing a statistical method that deals with the limitation that characterize survey-collected data. For our analysis, we use the UK Cybersecurity Breaches Survey, which is conducted annually in the UK among businesses and charities. We select 2 years, 2018-2019, and we chose this data set because it was designed precisely to assess the cost of cyber breaches and the expenses of on cybersecurity. The final data set we used consists of 2 pooled cross-section considering only for-profit firms. So we excluded charities from the sample. It is known that survey-collected data in general and cybersecurity data in particular present some weaknesses. For instance, in our dataset, we observe a relevant number of firms that is reporting 0 costs, either because they didn't suffer any cyber breach in the period of the survey, or because they didn't incur any loss in a consequence of a cyber breach. This is the so-called zero inflation problem, a problem that leads to biased estimates. Our dependent variable, as I said, is the cost of a cyber breach. As you can see from this table, there is indeed a problem of zero inflation. In fact, the first category, the one that goes from 0 to £500, is the second largest in both years. The distribution of the cost also does change from one year to the other. And we would like precisely to explain this change by considering some predictors. After a preliminary analysis using very simple models such as OLS, Ekman correction model, Probit, Logit, we selected this set of predictors that includes important variables like the presence of a cyber incident management plan, the expenses amount on cyber investment, the number of breaches, and controls like the size of the firms in terms of sales turnover and the sector of activity. To study ordinal variables like the cost of cyber breaches, it is standard practice in statistics to use Probit or Logit models. But if we were to use such models and simply disregarding the problem of zero inflation, we would get biased estimates as proved by many contributions in the literature. Therefore, we have to resort to other kind of models to tackle this problem first. And one is the so-called zero inflated interval regression model, which formalize the cost of cyber breaches as a latent variable, here y star, of which we can observe only the intervals, the vector gamma here. And then sets up two equations. So we have two stages in the model. The first equation models formalizes the probability of an actual loss, so a loss positive. And the second stage, the second equation, models the amount of the loss once the loss is positive from the first stage. So this let us model the zero inflation problem. In principle, we could use the usual maximum likelihood estimation procedure to estimate this model as formalized by equation number 3, computing the parameter theta and obtaining our estimate. However, another problem is that it is well known that maximum likelihood estimation method is biased when some assumptions are violated. For instance, when observations are not independent, or for instance, when we are not dealing with standard distribution, Claudia mentioned long tail distribution. So all of this violates the maximum likelihood estimation assumption. And this, of course, non-standard distribution and correlation characterize cybersecurity data. A possible way out of this problem is to assign then different weight to each observation within the likelihood function in equation number 3. In other terms, we replace the uniform weight 1 over n in equation number 3 with a vector pi hat in equation number 4. This is the only change we make. This weight assign more importance, so to speak, to those observations that better conform with the zero inflated interval regression distributional assumptions. We solved the maximization problem number 5. We obtained the solution number 6. And in the solution number 6, please notice that when alpha is equal to 0, we go back to our standard maximum likelihood estimation problem. This is the so-called exponential tilting method. To test the efficiency of this robust estimation method, we then generate a set of data from a zero inflated interval regression model according to the setting you see on this slide. And then we generate a dependent variable that is zero inflated, basically. And then we contaminate this simulated data set with outliers according to 3 different procedures. The third one you see is more interesting here because it simulates what really happens with correlated data, such as cybersecurity data. We allow for non-zero correlation then. In this table, I report the result for the third simulation only. We have a correlation coefficient of 0.25. We have different alpha from 0 to 1. In principle, alpha can go from 0 to infinite. And epsilon is the contamination level. Epsilon equal to 0.5 means that half of the sample is contaminated with outliers. And then we report the standard errors, the mean squared error of the estimation. We see that for a given epsilon, if we increase alpha, we obtain a lower standard error of the estimates up to a certain point. Here, for instance, epsilon equal to 0.2, we obtain lower error up to alpha equal to 0.7. So indeed, the method, the exponential tilting, is working in delivering better estimates. If we increase the correlation coefficient to 0.75, of course, the error gets worse everywhere. But still, if we fix epsilon and we increase alpha, the standard error decreases. So the method is really efficient. The next step is to apply the method to our data set. And these are the results. Here I report the result for alpha equal to 0, so the classical non-tilted model, and for alpha 0.75. We obtain this alpha by trial and error, basically. So in the non-tilted, first of all, observe that the tilted version of the model is indeed delivering estimates with lower, much lower standard error compared to the non-tilted version of the model. Then the first stage of the model, the first equation, in the non-tilted version, we do not detect any significant effect on the part of the sector of activity. While when we consider the tilted version, we see that some sectors are indeed significant in reducing the probability of suffering a positive loss from cyber breaches. Another point is that we do not detect much heterogeneity among the sectors because the values estimated are all around 1 point something. The only exception is the administration and real estate sector, which is really an outlier. For the second stage, we are particularly interested in the interaction between time and investment, because we want, as I said, we want to study the relation between investment and cost. And we see that in the tilted version, this interaction term is significant and negative. This means that investment have an impact in reducing the amount of the loss once the loss is positive. Another significant effect is the size of the firm. So the bigger the firm in terms of sales turnover, the higher is the loss as we would expect a priori. This paper, the contribution of this paper is twofold. First, it is the first time that a zero inflated ordinary probit model, class of models is applied to cybersecurity data. And we also propose a novel method to estimate this class of model in order to tackle the weaknesses of survey collected data in general and cybersecurity survey collected data in particular. The empirical results show that investment in cybersecurity has indeed an effect in reducing the average amount of the loss once the loss is positive. But there is also no relevant heterogeneity among the industrial sectors when we consider the probability of incurring a loss. The paper is still in a working paper status, so we appreciate any comment you might have. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you, Christian, again for this paper you just presented, and I think this paper is actually quite important because you're always going to have zero inflation in cybersecurity survey data. So I have a couple of points I wanted to make to get started. One is about the robustness of the approach, and it's more general, and the other is more specific on the way this model works. And by the way, excuse me if I'm not accurate, because I haven't worked with these models and I'm not super familiar with all the ins and outs of those. So the general point is, why did you choose to go for a zero inflation model as opposed to trying to impute the zeros? Basically, what I'm saying here is, if you use this kind of model, you're basically implicitly saying that the zeros to a certain extent are real. So you believe that this is a degenerate distribution where you have a lot of zeros, and even if this wasn't the case, you have no way of fixing it. So you go straight to a model that can deal with zero inflation. And of course, this is a perfectly legitimate choice, but I wonder whether you have thought about perhaps trying to adjust the data so that they represent more of a realistic picture of the situation. Because, you know, what I understood about these zeros is that in some cases, at least from the survey data I've seen, which included this data set, in some cases, the zeros are zeros. But in most cases, the zeros are companies not understanding what happened. And you will know that there are plenty of attempts that have been made, both in the theoretical literature and in surveys, to get firms to enumerate the cost items. So you can go in depth and ask the firm more questions, like, did you have to use time of your employees to fix this breach? How many hours were required to fix this breach? Did you have to spend time on customer relations, informing them? And if you go in depth, you find that indeed these things happened. There was a data breach and somebody had to fix it, and they had to invest some time in doing it, and perhaps they had to buy new cybersecurity products, or they had to consult with a cybersecurity firm. But mostly, especially when the costs are internal, firms, especially smaller firms, don't think anything of it. They say, oh, I have an IT guy, that's what he did that day. But no, I mean, that's actually the cost of the breach, because if the breach hadn't happened, the IT guy would have been working on something else. So this is why I'm insisting on, if there is a way to correct these zeros, you still will have some cases where the cost is exactly zero. But if there is a way to correct the zeros, I think this brings about a better understanding of the phenomenon. And this was the general point I wanted to make. And for the specific points on the model, they're just questions, really. Can you go back to the slide where you had equation 5? Okay, thank you. So this weighted MLE is the core innovation in your methodology, as far as I understand. I don't understand what the intuitive interpretation of this alpha should be, if there is an intuitive interpretation at all. I don't have an immediate understanding of how we should read those weights, because you're saying basically to avoid the estimates being biased, what I do is weight observations in such a way that some conditions are satisfied. Okay, I understand this. What I don't get is how do you choose how to allocate these weights, not in strictly mathematical terms, but does this reflect anything about the firms that you're choosing to weight more over the others? And I think I mean, there might be no interpretation of this, but if that's the case, you need to state it clearly, because it can be a bit puzzling. And third, you mentioned the correlation. Of course, we know that the cost of cybersecurity breaches has a correlation problem, and this is also one of the major problems in cyber insurance. I mean, think WannaCry, it affects a ton of people in the same way, and if you insured all of them, you have to, pay their claims, and it can be a problem. And generally, if I understand correctly, the way you test for correlation in losses is starting from specifics on which attacks happened. So here you don't have, as far as I recall, in this data set, you don't have the type of attack that happened, right? You don't know which specific attack hit those firms. So you're assuming there is a degree of correlation because you're assuming, based on what you see empirically, that some of these firms were involved in the same campaign, or I mean, how do you get to that conclusion? I mean, maybe it's just empirical, but I just wanted to know whether you had extra assumptions on why your data might show correlation, since the survey doesn't tell you much about this. And I think I'm done. And again, I remind everybody who might have joined us recently, if you want to ask the questions, please type them in the chat. I'll stop for now.
So thank you, Claudia, for your observation, always on the point. I will start from the end. The correlation. The correlation is really empirical issue. So we tested the correlation, taking the cost clustered by sector of activity. We have seen that, of course, if you take one sector and you see, you look into it, you see that the losses are correlated, highly correlated within the sectors. So it's really an empirical stuff here. How to read alpha? As I said, unfortunately, there is no mathematical method that can tell you, okay, this is the right alpha for your data set. So we choose alpha by trial and error. We see that when we choose alpha greater than 0.75, we obtain the same estimates, more or less, but with higher standard error. When we decrease alpha, we obtain different estimates with higher standard error. So the point is, where is the optimal point? And we see that it is at 0.75. So it's like here again, empirical, trial and error. What we could do is to devise a goodness of fit statistics that tells us how good is a model overall, and try to simulate via Monte Carlo simulation and see what is the alpha that gives us the better Monte Carlo simulation. and then apply this alpha to our real data. Instead, we adopted another method. We directly applied our method to the data, and by trial and error, we selected the alpha. I cannot tell you what is the best method, unfortunately. Imputing the zeros. Yes, we tried. We tried two things, actually. One thing is to consider, for instance, the time spent to restore a system. But we see that we didn't. First of all, the time is not significant in the estimates, and we have seen that it doesn't help us to discriminate between the zeros. So it doesn't have any role in helping us discriminating between the zeros. The second we tried to contact naively the statistical office in the UK responsible for the survey, tried to ask for the data points, tried to ask for at least for the cost variables, a variable that it is not organized in intervals, not organized in intervals, because they organize the variable in intervals to preserve the privacy of the respondents, basically. But we didn't have any answer. So working with the banded costs is the best we can do so far. And yes, we tried to imputing the real zero, but we didn't have any success in doing so.
Yeah, right, sure. I understand how this can be extremely challenging, and yes, I also understand the anonymization procedure that was employed by the UK statisticians. At least they could have given you, an estimated density distribution, which doesn't, of course, give you precise numbers, but gives you an idea of whether, most of the values are more to the left or the right of the bracket. So anyway, thank you for your answers, and I think
I have also been told that we can also apply for a freedom of information procedure to obtain the data points, but I think it is too demanding.
No, but I also think it won't work. I'm not sure about the UK now after Brexit, but if you did that in the EU, it wouldn't work because the freedom of information requests don't override privacy. Okay. So, I mean, it would never work if it was individuals. This is firms, so I'm not 100% sure. But if you asked to de-anonymize personal data based on a freedom of information request, so they will tell you no anyway. Maybe with firms, I mean, you might have a small chance. But anyway, thank you for the paper again, and I look forward to seeing other results in this literature. And so we're getting to the last paper of this session, and then I'm going to give a super short presentation of our data set. So in this case, Gabriele is going to be presenting the paper, and then my colleague from the Bank of Italy, Michele Savini-Zangrandi, is going to be starting the discussion. So I will shut up for a significant number of minutes now. And Gabriele, please go ahead with the closing paper of session 2. Gabriele, you're muted. We can't hear you.
That's fair. Okay. Now you should be able to hear me.
Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for introducing me again and for giving me this opportunity to present what I think is a very interesting paper to close this very interesting workshop. This is a joint work with Bill Megginson, who is an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma, my former PhD supervisor. And it's a paper that basically put together everything that we have said so far, the importance of cybersecurity risk and the exposure that the corporate world has now to external attackers trying to step in and steal private information. And in particular, what we're going to focus on is to try to find a different way to tease out, to provide an estimate, a data-driven estimate of the actual cost of state-mandated cyber espionage. Now, looking at the environment in which corporations find themselves working into, everything we have said can be summarized in this very nice statement by Robert Mueller back in 2012, when he basically said that ultimately we're living in a world in which there are only two types of firms, those that have already been hacked, those that will be hacked, and these two groups are converging in one single group, firms that have been hacked and will be hacked again. There's no escape in a digitalized world in which everybody's interconnected, in which all operations are moved online. There is this risk and we need to recognize it. If we look at the data, Christian already mentioned something, but if we look at the time series, there is a clear trend. The number of attacks is increasing. The severity of this attack is somewhat linearly increasing over time. This is a risk that matters. Yet, I think there's something that is generally overlooked, especially by the generalist media, and this is the fact that despite the fact that we talk a lot about privacy-related issue, theft of third-party information, credit cards number, customer information, broadly speaking, a very large percentage of cyber attacks are actually directed towards stealing very well-defined assets, trade secrets, intellectual properties, blueprints, chemical formula, software codes. This is where the bulk of the value risk that we have globally really lies into. All the big numbers that Claudia mentioned before, the $2, $3, $4, $500 billion of annual costs that the global economy face, they're ultimately driven by having these very valuable assets, these strategic assets, attackable basically by external agents, by malicious third parties. And in particular, just to give you some number, if we look at the manufacturing industry, according to PwC, a recent report in 2019, about 95% of these attacks, of cyber attacks, are indeed directly, specifically towards attempting to appropriate these kind of assets. So we're talking about something material, and the cost, as I've already anticipated, are not peanuts. According to the Department of Justice, these numbers are probably inflated for political reasons, but Chinese mandated cyber attack targeting intellectual properties of U.S. corporations cost the U.S. economy somewhat in between $200 to $600 billion. Now, as you can see, the range is very wide. It's very difficult to estimate such a cost. And this is why research in this area is so important, because we need to find a way to independently assess if cyber espionage is relevant, how much does it cost, and how firms are reacting and markets are responding to it. Now, let me stress the fact that our focus on state-sponsored, state-mandated cyber attacks does not come out of the blue. It's not just something that it's interesting to us, but it derives by the fact that governments or government agencies, they have resources, they have the power to break through very sophisticated systems, and they do so. Cyber attacks mandated or linked to government agency or directly with to foreign governments are the name of the game. If we just look at the last 4 months, we have tens of cases, even more probably, of foreign governments attempting to break into U.S. corporation, European corporation, or even in the IT systems of the U.S. governments or of the European Union. For instance, in February, we had a clear evidence that North Korea was trying to hack into Pfizer to steal data concerning the chemical formula and the trials of the Pfizer vaccine for COVID-19. We have the Sunburst attack, which is a very severe event that is redesigning and will have very lasting implication for the U.S. cybersecurity environment and cyberspace. So this is something that is happening. There's somewhat of a warfare taking place in the cyberspace. And as economists, as policymakers, we need to understand what's really going on. in an independent way. So what we do here in this specific paper is to study a very, very interesting set of reforms that took place between 2015 and 2017 in China. What happened is that the Chinese government implemented a set of reforms aimed at completely revolutionizing the way they deal with cybersecurity. And in particular, these reforms are extremely interesting because they are probably the first important case of this country reforming the cybersecurity institutional framework, not from the perspective of defending themselves against third party, against malicious attack, but from an offensive perspective, legalizing to a certain extent forms of corporate espionage, of international espionage, and providing unprecedented power to the Chinese government in terms of its ability to operate in cyberspace and observe private information. Indeed, simplifying what has happened with the national security law that was approved in 2015, the most material implication for especially multinational corporations was that if you are working with data that are relevant for Chinese individuals or Chinese firms, now you need to physically store this data in China. Which means that you need, if you are working with big data, and all big corporations are nowadays, you need to have a data center within the borders of China. That was step one. In 2016, what happened is that with the cybersecurity law, the Chinese government said no data center, therefore, with a few exceptions, can be fully owned by a foreign entity. So now, example given, Apple must establish a joint venture or to attract some foreign investors, some Chinese investors within the ownership structure of their data center, of the subsidiary that manage their data ownership. Third, in 2017, this is the coup de grace, this is a very aggressive political move. The Chinese government said, okay, if there is a data center that is at least partially owned by a Chinese investor and is located in China, I can gain physical access to it, so I can see all the privileged information within it for no better specified reason of national security. This obviously ignited a huge international debate. All, especially US high-tech firms, started to fight against such a proposal, a law proposal back in time, labeling it as a form of legal cyber espionage. The White House tried to weigh in, and that was a big part of the tariff war that we had during the Trump era. But ultimately, China stood its ground. All these reforms got passed and they're fully active and applied today in 2021. So we are working now in an environment in which basically we have increased the ability and to a certain extent provided legal ground for the Chinese government to not steal, that's a strong word, but appropriate private information of foreign firms, multinational corporations operating in the Chinese market. And this is extremely problematic from a regulatory perspective, from a legal perspective, from a corporate management perspective. But from an academic perspective, this is a very interesting laboratory to study how much state-mandated, especially Chinese state-mandated cyber espionage is costing to high-tech corporations, specifically in the United States, which is where the focus of our studies will go to, but with an acceptable degree of external validity, of a generalization to Western firms. And what we do specifically in this paper, rather than trying to engage in some sophisticated statistical model, we keep it as simple as possible. We have a shock. We know that the market is relatively efficient, especially in the United States. There's a lot of liquidity. The level of mispricing is acceptable. What we do is to run an event study around the approval date of these reforms to see how international investors having equity stakes in these firms in US high-tech corporation exposed to the Chinese market, how they price such an effect. And what we observe is surprising because it's extremely material in economic terms. On average, every time one of these reforms was approved, US public enterprises exposed to the Chinese market lost something in between 1% to 2.5, 3% of their market capitalization. So huge cost, a lot of money that were burning the US public equity market. And just to give you a sense of the economic relevance of these shocks, we're talking about on average for each approval, $200 million in market capitalization that got burned. It just vanished away overnight. Now, just for the sake of talking about the econometrics, the national security law in 2015, the approval process was relatively long. There were a lot of discussion. So these estimates that you see here, they're likely to be biased downward because there's a clear anticipation effect. However, especially in the cybersecurity law, it was approved not overnight, but in a matter of 1 week, right after the annual convention of the Chinese Communist Party. So it was very sudden, and these estimates are likely to be relatively unbiased, or at least to suffer only marginally from an anticipation effect. But if such an effect exists, it's going to bias us towards finding no results. So finding anything at all is outstanding. Doing some simple math, overall, well, we can come up with aggregating all these market reaction is a cause of this marginal increase of the ability of the Chinese government to engage in form of cyber espionage. So nothing has happened. This is all in expectation. And such a cost is as high as about 120 billion US dollar. It's a one-time shock. $120 billion disappear from the market equity, from the public equity space, which sounds like a crazy number. But again, if you remember the estimates of the area of the annual losses caused by Chinese mandated cyber espionage targeting US intellectual properties, which range between $200 to $600 billion, it sounds reasonable, which implies that the DOJ estimates are probably not far off, or at least they're used as a benchmark by investors trying to price such a risk in the equity price. So overall, what we're showing here with this very simple test is that investors are pricing aggressively the risk of cyber espionage mandated by the Chinese government. The big question that remains, though, is who's benefiting from it. We see that there's a cost for US and probably, broadly speaking, Western corporation. Is there something that is materially benefiting from such a shock? So what we do, we focus our attention now on the Chinese public equity market. And in particular, we split up the sample in privately owned firms, so firms with zero state ownership, and state-owned enterprises, which are publicly traded enterprises in which the Chinese government has directly a stake, an ownership stake in these firms. And we replicate our simple experiment. And what we find is extremely interesting, because for privately owned firms, nothing happened. This makes sense. It's consistent with our prior, because ultimately Chinese firms were already virtually fully compliant with these regulations, so nothing material has hit privately owned Chinese firms. However, look what happened to state-owned Chinese enterprises. Huge positive reaction in the order of 1 to 2% increase in market capitalization, which is consistent with our story. But ultimately, what's happening here is that the Chinese cybersecurity reforms has truly provided some legal ground for the Chinese government to gain access to private information of foreign institutions, of foreign firms operating in the Chinese product market. And what this results is actually suggesting us is that not only the government, this mystic and abstract entity, can get access to this private information, but also the market expects the government to leak this information strategically to the state-owned enterprises operating in China. So overall, what we're really showing here are quite strong evidences providing support about the fact that this aggressive stand that China is taking in terms of cybersecurity regulation is severely harming Western economy, and in particular with respect to the United States, we estimate this cost to be somewhere in the range of $100 to $120 billion. So not peanuts at all. And in particular, such a cost for Western firms is paired by material economic benefits captured by state-owned enterprises in China, who are benefiting probably from two major forces. First, a reduction in competition in the product market. Now, if you want to operate in China, your compliance costs are much higher because you need to store everything in China. Everybody, the government has potentially access to your information. And so the competition level in Chinese product market decline. And on top of that, your peers overseas now see a declining value in their intellectual properties and trade secrets, making in relative terms Chinese firms operating in certain industries, especially the high-tech one, more competitive, at least on the domestic arena. So these are very important evidence that highlight the importance of at least reacting to the aggressive stand that China is imposing on the world in matter of cybersecurity regulation and institutional reforms. Because ultimately what's really happening here is that we're observing an invisible warfare that is deeply damaging shareholders of Western corporations, or at least of US corporations. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion or any question you might have. And again, thank you, Claudia, for this opportunity of presenting this work here at this workshop.
So thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriele, for this very, very interesting presentation. I think there's a mic on.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for Claudia.
No, I think we can hear you fine. It's
okay, great.
Sorry about that.
So thank you so much for this really interesting presentation. I think it's great to have discussion started on this really important issue. I mean, I guess this is one of the hardest things to get at, trying to quantify the cost of cyber attacks, and particularly those that are state-sponsored. So, I mean, congrats for the effort. It's brilliant. I have a ton and a half of questions, and I'll try to go through in some order, but I probably won't manage, so bear with me. So as far as I understand, your sample consists of companies that, US companies, that are listed and have exposure to the Chinese market. What does that mean exactly? They have operations in China, they have sales in China, they have data physically stored in China. So I think it'd be useful to know exactly what we're looking at to see how well we can generalize from there to the broader economy. Which leads me to the second question, which is you're estimating the cost in terms of before and after. But if, according to the definition you have of your sample, is it possible to have a treatment control group as well? Can you identify similar firms that are not exposed to the Chinese market and see what the impact on those have been? Falling off from that, I was wondering, you know, basically you're trusting the market to assess the value of the damage, which makes me wonder, I mean, the market is superbly efficient, but does it know? And does it have enough time to know? You're looking at a rolling window of 10 days to estimate the long-term consequences of losses in trade secrets, and I mean, pretty complex stuff, I would imagine. So it's the best thing we got, and it's brilliant you tried, but how much can we trust it? 1 second while I look through my notes. Off from that, I think it's, I mean, having an impact on the market for 10 days is pretty impressive. I was wondering how lasting that is. If you've looked into, you know, that will disappear eventually, but how long does it take? Is there, you know, what's the longer term consequences on these firms? Is there an impact on the debt side as well? Do people think that once they lost the trade secrets, they become less sustainable, so their debt management costs become higher? Is there, we talked a lot about distribution across sectors. So some sectors are, you know, defy gravity better than others. you probably haven't had time to look at the distribution, but I mean, what is your sense of the distribution of these losses? Are they pretty concentrated on some firms? Do they do well? Are they spread out? Because there's losses and losses, right? We've seen from the Section 301 investigation that theft of trade secrets in the solar sector killed it. That was it. Firms were gone bankrupt. That might not be the same in other sectors. So I don't know what's your impression. That last question. I can keep going, but for the sake of time, I want to give you time to answer to all of this. If we take your estimate as a good check of what the Department of Justice has, we're about there. What is your sense of, or do you have a sense that you thought of where the rest comes from? So if you know, the damage to listed firms is in the ballpark of 200 billion, where on society does the other 600 fall? You know, who's bearing the rest of that cost? And that's probably a question we don't have an answer to, and that's something we can look into. So I'll shut up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to think about, and so many brilliant questions. First of all, let me apologize with you because I sent the slides very late, so you didn't have time to spend time on the actual material. But great questions. So let me try to answer in order. So first of all, what does exposure to Chinese market means? Unfortunately, I cannot clearly observe if you actually have operations in China. I can have some proxy. What I can observe using the segment data is to see whether we have sales in China. And that's, as a first order approximation, that's what I'm using. Now, with respect to this specific reform, I think that having revenues is a sufficient condition to a certain extent for being exposed to the consequences of these reforms. The reason being that if you are trying to penetrate the product market, you are very likely to gather information concerning Chinese customers, eventual suppliers, and so on, whether business or private citizens, and that would already subject you to the national security reform of 2015. So I think that the degree of measurement error that we have here is at the very least acceptable. So we're using revenues in China as a proxy for exposure to the market. Which links to your second question, which is exactly what we're doing now, trying to find a treatment and control group. So what we have done is basically to run a placebo test so far, using firms that have zero exposure whatsoever to the Chinese market. We identify this firm looking at whether they've always had any M&A with targeting Chinese firms, and if they have zero sales in China. If we run the experiment on these firms, we will find absolutely no market reaction to the shock. So it means that using this firm to a certain extent, it's not a perfect treatment group, but as a placebo group at the very least, allow us to at least support the claim that the abnormal performance around this space can be at least partially linked with the passage of the law and the increased ability of the Chinese government to capture private informations, which though opens up a couple of important questions which link to your third question. First of all, yes, these are short-term effects. Unfortunately, we try to go longer. From what I've seen, I haven't tried all the estimates, but after 1 month, the effect in terms of abnormal performance dissipates. After 10 days, it becomes very weak. I think it's just a statistical residual of the initial very strong effects. I was very much surprised to see, especially for the 2015 reform, the effect increasing in the length of the window. That's something that I cannot really explain yet. I don't know if it's due to an anticipation effect, and so going back in time allows me to capture more of the effect, but that's something that we're still trying to clear up. The second consequence is that using a short-term effect allows us to see how the market immediately react under the assumption of market efficiency, when we can say that this is the actual cost. But what we can't do yet, and we're trying to find a way to do that, is to actually pinpoint the origin of these costs. Because ultimately there are two effects. First, as you said, trade secrets now are available for grab. The Chinese government can step in and steal them. Or second, the cost of operating in China now materially increase. So there are these two forces that we're trying to tease out, but it's not easy without introducing some form of forward-looking bias. Because what we were thinking about doing is to see whether your market penetration in China decline over time, but that will not make perfectly the trick. But that's something that we were trying to disentangle, and using short-term events is extremely complicated. I love this cost of equity capital and debt capital. That can be something extremely interesting to look at, especially considering the fact that in the US, to a certain extent, innovation output, broadly speaking, might be pledged as a collateral. So there might be something to look at to see whether the capital structure of these firms that are affected by these international reforms push up or down a firm's leverage level. Finally, what was the last question again? I forgot that.
I think there was on the distribution of losses.
Oh yeah, thank you. So the effect is virtually fully driven by high-tech industries. So we're talking about, broadly speaking, Silicon Valley and Boston with the biotech area. That makes 99% of the effect, which to a certain extent makes sense, because ultimately that's where the real benefit risk is. I don't expect Domino's Pizza to be a major potential target for the Chinese government. Now, with respect to the unexplained part of the cost that we're unable to observe, there are two considerations. The first one is that what we're really doing here is not to estimate the full cost, but the marginal increase in the cost for corporation in present value. So that it's a subtle difference, but it's an important one. The second one, we are only looking at publicly traded enterprises. Now, what I believe to be extremely important to estimate economy-wide the cost of these kind of cyber espionage, especially the state-sponsored one, are private firms operating in with the government through military contracts and so on. That's where a huge amount of the vendor risk might be, especially for the United States. And unfortunately, today, I'm unable to capture that because a lot of these firms are private, and so I can't estimate the cost for these firms. What I'm doing now, though, is to download all the data from the US government website, which I'm blank. Anyway, I'm basically identifying all the firms that have contracts with the US government in place to try to see whether there's a differential effect there. But again, it's going to be on the subsample of publicly traded firms because that's what's observable.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll leave it to Claudia because I understand she might have a few additional questions.
Thanks. Thank you, Michele.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michele, for this very interesting discussion. I just have one question, really. It's more like thinking aloud. So I'm wondering how much of a structural break are these laws, and you know, on which level exactly? Because of course the Chinese secret services did not start spying the day the law came into effect. So basically the law was just, I suppose, the law was just a way of publicizing and making clear in a legal framework what was already happening. So I wonder if there is a way, I mean, this could be an interesting angle, because what you see in your regressions in this case would be purely an awareness effect in terms of, you know, companies that had already been hit by Chinese espionage knew that Chinese espionage was an issue. but other companies might be exposed to China and not know that espionage was such a huge problem. But then the state, enacts a law, so they cannot but know it. So it could be an awareness effect. Of course, you would need data on Chinese-sponsored cyber attacks before the laws to separate the two. But I wonder if you can mention this in some way in the paper, because I think it's worth it. I mean, it's an interesting angle.
I totally agree. So it goes back to what I was discussing with Michele before, which is what is the market actually pricing at the very end. And ultimately, what's happening here are investors realizing or updating their prior with respect to the likelihood of this kind of event happening, which it makes extremely interesting from a measuring perspective, because now we can really capture this expected loss as seen from investor who only base their belief on public available data, but there's a limitation that we're unable to actually grab the full extent of this cost for American corporation or for Western corporation, broadly speaking. What I can do, but I'm not, what I might be able to do, looking at newspaper articles, is to try basically to identify those data breaches that hit publicly traded corporations over the period 2005 to 2020, for which I have data, and try to spot those for which the Chinese government was somewhat blamed for. My prior would be that the number of these kind of cases is going to be extremely limited, maybe 20 to 30 cases, maybe, but it is worth exploring this dimension to get a better understanding of what's going on. But look, at the very end, again, it's a matter of sample size and then effectiveness in our ability to estimate such an effect. Unfortunately, it's a non-observable variable. I need to think about a way to measure such an unobservable. I would have to use a structural model to try to tease out these intent costs, but it might be extremely complicated and rely on very strong assumption, which might undermine at the very end the whole scope of the experiment, which is to try to get a ballpark estimate of what's really happening in the global economy. We are juggling with limited information, and we're trying our best. And I believe that at the very least, what we can do here is to say, look, the estimates of the DOJ are not just blatantly wrong. There is something in what they're saying is not just a geopolitical game. The cost at the annual cost might be somewhere there, but the marginal increase is consistent with that kind of estimates, and which I think it's already a very strong, a very important starting point to open up a discussion about how, if, and when to react to this aggressive stand that China is taking towards cybersecurity regulation in general.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabriele. This was very informative. And okay, so we're at the end of the second session. I will ask Matteo to please enable my sharing of my screen, because now I'm due for a short presentation of a data set on the frequency and cost of cyber attacks that was assembled by the Bank of Italy. Some of you in the audience might already know this data set, but I want to present it because I'll spoil the end of this presentation and say this is a data set that is free for researchers, so it might be an interesting starting point for some of your analysis, and I want you to know that it exists and what is in there. So let me get started. We have mentioned several times in the workshop that there is a cybersecurity data gap. And there are two dimensions of this data gap. The first dimension is the sparse availability of independent sources. We said most data is from corporates active in cyber defense. And then we have an issue of data quality. We have an issue of under detection. So firms don't know they were attacked. They know they were attacked, but they don't know they spent the money to fix the breach. They don't classify the money spent in the appropriate way. You have the long tail issue because because you have, you know, tens of millions of tiny, you know, situations where a firm is attacked. Maybe somebody clicks on a phishing link, but maybe this is very old malware that doesn't do much, and it's removed with one workday. And then on the other side, you have SolarWinds, which like destroys the world. So it's pretty hard to measure. And a number of other issues mentioned in the workshop. So why did we start collecting data? We started collecting data because back in 2016, when we started, there was absolutely no official data on cyber breaches for Italy. Everything we could rely on was privately sourced data, which was mostly at the regional level, covering the EU, not even the country. So we thought we need to do something about this. And we had a tool that is not born for cybersecurity. It's a tool that was born in the 70s, I think in 1972, and it's a system of business surveys. It was originally born with one survey, and now it's a system, a galaxy of business surveys. So we have a sample that comprises about 4,000 firms with 20 employees or more. This sample is statistically representative by macro-region, size class, and certain aggregations of sectors at the two-digit level. These surveys are multi-purpose. Basically, they were born to cover the dynamic of core business indicators of Italian firms. So turnover, investment, employment. And then we have time-varying monographic sections that are included based on contingent informational needs. And there's dozens of those over the years, and the typical respondents are either executives or administrative staff with a broad knowledge of the business. Is mostly not tech people, but we had several monographic sections. So, for example, the adoption of new technologies, recently the adoption of AI, of the Internet of Things, investments in some specific technologies or under some specific laws that give incentives for technological change, etc. And this is a part of a wider system of business surveys. It's routinely used in academic research. I won't bore you with the details of this. Let's just say for the moment that we have a small survey in the fall, a big survey in the spring, and those are the two main pillars of this system. If you want to know more, just visit the website, and you will find a lot of information also on the smaller satellite surveys. So anyway, we ran a pilot in 2016 in the small survey. Small meaning small as in short. The sample is always the same. It's roughly these 4,000 firms. There is sort of 20% panel attrition, so there is a refreshing of the sample that goes quite fast, but not too fast. So panel analysis is still possible. So in 2016, we tried a very first response to the data gap for Italy, and we tried to include two questions in the 2016 Business Outlook survey, which is a small survey. So the first question was about cybersecurity governance. We wanted to know whether companies took care of cyber risk with internal resources via outsourcing. Remember, this was 2016, and these last 5 years have been like a century in cyber. Back then, this was a relevant question. And then we had the first attempt for our core question, which is over the last year, how many times you were hit by a cyber attack. And you can imagine how hard it was to talk to firms about cyber attacks when most of them didn't know what a cyber attack was, especially small firms. And implicitly, we made the same choice that the UK survey would make a couple of years after. We didn't do this on purpose. It was happenstance. So we asked companies to only consider the attacks that had consequences, no matter how limited and short-lived or easily reversible, on the functioning of the firm's systems and or on the integrity and confidentiality of data. So this was the first attempt. It led to a first estimate of the number of firms that were affected by attacks in Italy. It was roughly 30 to 50%, depending on the assumptions of the model used to correct the data. And this created a lot of interest, so we decided to go on. In 2017, in the big survey, we had a deep dive on cyber, which, as far as I know, is still the most extensive source of official data on cybersecurity that is available to researchers for Italy. So we had 4 questions about the cybersecurity measures that were adopted by firms. A question about expense to prevent cyber attacks in 2016. Then we asked, were you hit by a cyber attack? We asked about the damage, asking whether the attacks implied interruption of ordinary business, extra working hours, theft or destruction of data. We asked for the monetary value of the damage done by the cyber attacks, and then we wanted to know whether extra cybersecurity measures were adopted as a consequence of these attacks. Of course, plenty of measurement problems with these variables. If you want to know more about the results of these deep dives, there is a paper, and you can find it on the Bank of Italy website. I don't want to discuss results now. I just want to discuss how this data set is made. So in 2017, we also added a cyber insurance section to the small survey. It was a very simple section. First, we asked whether the firm was insured against risks posed by cyber attacks, differentiating between a standalone cyber policy, which is very rare, and cyber risk coverage through a broader policy that also covers other risks. And for the uninsured firms, we wanted to know why the firm was not insured. With the options being, we believe it's not necessary, the cost will be too high, and the market does not offer a policy that is adequate to our needs. Then, of course, as you can imagine, different areas of research at the Bank of Italy have different needs, and all of them want questions in the surveys to carry out this research. So we had to scale down on the sections starting 2018, but we kept the time series alive. So between 2018 and 2021, the survey is being carried out right now. We had a routine question in 2017, 18, 19, respectively, were hit by a cyber attack. So basically, starting from the survey carried out in 2017 and referring it to 2016, and ending with this year's survey, which refers to 2020, we have a consistent time series with the same question being asked to this large sample of firms. And we're planning another deep dive for the future as soon as other items on the research agenda allow. But what I wanted to tell you is that everybody can access this data at no cost. All you need to do is apply, which means you get to tell us who you are and what your research project is, but these requests are granted. Remote access for confidentiality reasons was the choice we made in technical terms. This is exactly what Christian said about laws preventing you from releasing exact data that could identify firms. But instead of releasing to the public a partial data set, what we did instead was allow remote access to the full data set. Of course, there are certain safeguards in the system that prevent you from running a code that could re-identify the firms. And as far as we know, we were not fooled yet by some hacker. I mean, there is a machine that looks at the listings, but there's also human beings. So far, I guess this system was not breached and is proving pretty robust. R and Stata are supported languages for this system, and you can also download a mock data set from the internet where the data are fake, but the structure of the variables is actually the real structure. So if you want to test your own code before sending it in to avoid an endless back and forth of error messages because the code didn't work, you can write the code on the mock data set and then send it to the system and get your results back. This said, I think I'm running out of time, and this is actually everything, all I wanted to say on this data set. So before I get to the wrap up, I would ask, is there any question or observation on the data set? Anything you want to know about this? Okay, so
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe you told us, but I didn't catch it. How many data points there are in the surveys currently?
Okay, the sample is roughly 4,000 firms, And these are firms of the non-financial private sector with 20 employees and above. So you don't have the banks. I mean, we have data on the financial sector, but this is confidential for legal reasons. But in this survey, you don't have the financial sector and you don't have the small firms. These 4,000 firms are part of a panel with roughly 20% attrition rate. So every time we run a survey after refreshing the sample for statistical reasons, we try to recontact the firms that participated in the previous survey. So indeed, we do have a real panel for part of the sample, and part of this panel also goes way back because we've had firms participating in the survey for like 30 years. And certainly you would find a subset of firms that have answered the cybersecurity question every year starting in 2016.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So, okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat on the data set, so I come to a very short wrap up. It's not going to last 15 minutes, except if any of you wants to chime in. I just have 3 very short things to say. The first is thank you for participating in this session. The second is we're looking to repeat the session again at next year's Italian Cybersecurity Conference. And now that we have restarted the tradition of economics of cybersecurity, I think we have to open this to submissions. This year we went for the invited talks because we had to set up the machine again. Next year the workshop is going to have open submissions. So if you're writing papers on this subject, start to think if you want to contribute. The final thing is that at the Bank of Italy this fall, starting November, we're going to have a course on economic security, which is going to take a look at how issues related to national security and issues related to economics intersect. This is mostly an internal course, but we are going to have limited availability for external PhD students. Cyber is definitely one of the themes that is going to be addressed, not in terms of measurement or hardcore econometrics, because this is more of a course about security and geopolitics and strategy. But there certainly is going to be space for topics such as the one that was just discussed by Gabriele. And generally speaking, we're going to focus on how the cyber threats are evolving and what this means in economic terms. So if any of you either is a PhD student or has a PhD students that you think might be interested, again, we have limited availability, so we will have to make some selection, but please keep in touch with me and I can give you more information as it becomes available. I'll just share the screen again for a moment, for a second, so I can show you my email address. For any issue related to next year's workshop or this course or any of the work we did at the Bank of Italy, this is my email address, and you can write me at any time, and also put you in touch with the larger team at the Bank of Italy that's working around these issues. And Gabriele, the answer to your question is certainly yes. Let's talk about this bilaterally, and I'll let you know in more detail what's going on. So I see there is another question. Okay, so Gabriele is asking, do we plan to add questions concerning work from home arrangements and their implications for cybersecurity risk, such as bring your own laptop policies, use of VPN to connect to the corporate servers? This is a very good question, a very helpful question. Actually, we haven't thought about what to ask in the next deep dive, because the space is extremely limited and we will have to select 2 or 3 subtopics for maximum. I think this is one of the, I mean, I hadn't started thinking about what to put in there, but this is a brilliant suggestion, and I'll definitely take it on board. it's a very good idea. And again, on the question on the course, of course, feel free to get in touch. Okay, so if nobody has any other comment, I will leave you to either attend another ITASEC session, or more realistically, have lunch. So thank you for being here, and we'll see each other next year, hopefully in person.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And thank you, Matteo, for hosting us. Ciao.
Thank you for the nice session.